So good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Michael Romano. I don't like having to lean in like this. See if I can fix this. You can all hear me okay?
Yes.
So my name is Michael Romano. I'm a partner with FESNAC, LLP. We're a regional CPA firm located right down the street here, around the corner in Blue Bell, Pennsylvania. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the second of our Growth Summit series. This is a series of events that FESNAC is hosting once a quarter, leading up to a quarterly summit half-day event in November timeframe, talking about some of the critical issues and key things that companies need to know and focus on to grow their businesses. For those of you who don't know FESNAC, just briefly, we are a regional CPA firm located in Blue Bell. We're a diverse team of accounting, tax, audit, and consulting professionals, really offering a broad base of practical advice and guidance for our clients in the area. I am the partner in charge of the life science practice of the group. And I'm really excited and pleased to be here this morning to moderate this panel entitled Value Creation for Today's Clinical Research Organization. So as many as you know, I imagine already much about the CRO space, but just a few things to kind of set the table for this morning's discussion. CROs, as you know, are at the forefront of the drug development process. They are creating value, enhancing the drug development process, and reshaping it. CROs conduct more than 2/3 of the world's industry's phase 1 through phase 3 clinical trials globally. And a fact that I came upon recently that I thought was pretty interesting, it kind of just tells the tale a little bit of some of the trends that are going on, is that CROs now employ more R&D talent than all of pharma and biotech combined in the research and development space. So our panel discussion today will discuss the evolving role of the outsourced clinical research organization and how CROs create and enhance value not only for themselves, but for their shareholders and the clients that they serve. So I'd like to outline the goals of the panel discussion and objectives of the discussion for you this morning, and in a moment I'm going to introduce our panelists here to my left. So the goal of today's discussion is to offer some practical advice and guidance and share knowledge and insights with all of you pertaining to creating and enhancing value for today's clinical research organization. But in order to do this, I'd like to first take a moment to talk to you about value. What is value? How is it defined? How is it created? In an economic sense, value can be defined in a multitude of ways. There's fair market value. There's investment value or strategic value. There's book value and things like liquidation value. Each of these have different meanings within a particular business context. Webster simply defines value as the amount of money that something is worth. But for purposes of this morning's discussion, I'd like you to think about value in this context. Value is the dollar amount placed on the business as measured by the return, and the return in terms of the cash flow that the business generates divided simply by the rate of return, or which is the interest rate, which really is a reflection of the risk of the business. So in this context, there are really two key elements, two key influences that I'm talking about that impact the value of the business. That being the cash flow and the risk associated with the business. We've provided in your handouts and materials on your desk for you, on your tables for you this morning, tabletops, an outline that FESNAC has put together. We do a lot of business valuations. We get engaged by clients to value businesses or to do what we call an education of value. And through the years, we've come up with what we think are the top 10 areas to focus on to enhance the value of your business. So there's a handout there that hopefully you can take away and it will be some value to you after the meeting. So you'll see many of the points on this handout either directly or indirectly touch upon the cash flows, increasing sales or decreasing costs to enhance the cash flows of the business, or the risk factors, how to mitigate risk or mitigate or take away some of the risk. So much of today's discussion will focus and touch upon many of these areas. But we'll also discuss this morning value in a traditional business sense for other areas such as intellectual property, customers, proprietary business processes or methodologies, things like innovation, industry trends, regulatory environment, and the like, all of which do have an impact on the value of the business. So as we proceed with our discussion this morning, we'll take a look at the macro environment in the life sciences today and its influence on the clinical research organization and their ability to create value for themselves and their shareholders. And then the specific CRO market and the dynamics in that market and its impact on value. All of this I'm just serving up as food for thought for the discussion this morning when we talk about value and the concept of value for and the influences thereon for the clinical research organization. So with that, without further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce now the panelists for you this morning. So immediately to my left, your right, is Michael Martorelli. Welcome, Michael, to the panel. Thank you for being here with us. Michael's a director at Fairmount Partners. For those of you who may know or heard of them, Fairmount is an investment banking firm located right down the street here in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania. Michael's a member of Fairmount's Healthcare Industry Investment Group. An analyst his entire career, he's focused on the pharma service company space, such as CROs, and those companies providing tools and technology to enhance clinical research. Michael often participates in conferences and public speaking. He's spoken at the Partnerships for CROs conference, and he's written for Pharmaceutical Executive. Michael is the author of Fairmount's quarterly report, The Pharmaceutical Outsource Monitor. We've provided a copy of that report for you this morning to take away and take a look at. It's a pretty nicely done outlook on the market and overview of the market. So thank you, Michael, for being here this morning. Immediately to Michael's left is Jean Marie Markham. I've had the pleasure of knowing Jean Marie for a number of years now. She's the founder, president, and CEO of ClinLogix LLC. So ClinLogix is a multinational CRO offering clinical research services and solutions to pharma, med device, and biotech. A nurse by training, she's built her career as strategic thinking and problem solver for the life science industry. Recently, over the past year, Jean Marie has completed 2 strategic acquisitions for her business, one in Germany and the other in Colombia, South America, both strengthening her global footprint in the market. And more recently, or I know in the past recent years, she's been focusing her business more on offering clinical research solutions for the medical device space. So I think, and I'm excited to listen and hear some of Jean Marie's perspectives for today. Thanks, Jean Marie, for joining us. Immediately to her left is Gene Vadavaz. Gene is the CFO of ACT Oncology. He's an industry veteran with 19 years of experience in several key financial and general management roles in the pharma and biotech space. Prior to joining ACT, he was the VP and Chief Accounting Officer at PharmaNet, where he took the company private and sold it eventually to Inventive Health. So ACT Oncology, you may not know, is a niche focused oncology business, focusing on providing clinical research services in that space. And I'm sure Gene will also bring a valuable perspective to the discussion this morning. Thanks, Gene, for being here. And then lastly, a new addition, recent addition over the past week to the panelists is Jason Monteleone. Jason is the CFO over at Theorem over in King of Prussia, also very close to us here. Another industry veteran, Jason had numerous positions in a senior finance capacity. Prior to Theorem, he was recently at MDS Pharma, Viasys Healthcare, and prior to that, GE Capital. He's been involved with Theorem over the past several years, and he was involved in the private equity firm buyout of Theorem from its parent Omnicare, which I think was completed 2011, okay. Past 3 years. So a little known fact about Theorem. Theorem once started out as a very small company when the space was relatively new, as biopharma clinical services back in the late 80s, early 90s, and then became IBAH, then was sold to Omnicare in the late 90s, and then in 2011 was taken back private again and it's renamed as Theorem. When I first left public accounting in 1994, I was a senior staff accountant over at IBAH, or Biopharma Clinical Services. So that started my career in the CRO space and my fascination and really enjoyment of the space. And I spent many years there. So just a little bit of fact, kind of a small world. You're sitting here on the panel. Welcome, Jason. Glad to have you as part of the discussion.
Thank you.
So with that, now I've told you a little bit about us. I'd like to just poll the audience very briefly to see maybe what kind of different constituents we have in the audience. So maybe by show of hands, can you tell me how many people in the audience currently work in or operate or own a clinical research organization? Okay. A handful of folks. Anyone recently complete or been involved in a transaction of a CRO, either buy side, sell side, or consulting? Okay. How about others involved? I expected you. How about others involved in the outsourced clinical trial space or outsourced R&D? Okay, so a good cross-section of folks in the room. So with that, I'd like to dive into our questions. So what we'll do now is I'd like to spend the next 30 minutes, 30, 40 minutes or so serving up some questions to the panelists, and they'll have a dialogue and give some feedback and some thoughts on the different questions. If you could maybe make a note of questions that you might have as we proceed throughout our discussion, we'll take maybe 10 or 15 minutes towards the end. I'd definitely like to do a Q&A session at that point to hear from all of you and have a dialogue from the audience with our questions. And then maybe we'll do a wrap-up and we'll hear from each of the panelists with some final closing thoughts, some key takeaways, and then we'll get you on with the rest of your day. So that's kind of the way I see the next 45 minutes or so going, if that works for everybody here. So with that, okay, Michael Martorelli. So, obviously, you spent a lot of time analyzing the space. I know you're about to put out a new pharma outsource monitor publication. So if we could start with you, Michael, and you could offer maybe a 30,000-foot view overview of the CRO market for our discussion this morning. What maybe current market trends or dynamics are you seeing?
Okay. I think the best way to summarize it is that the CRO industry is growing very, very nicely. And of course, we don't talk about the CRO industry, but we talk about the CRO industries, because there's a clear difference in the way I see the world, the way the world looks to me. Most drug development companies are recognizing the benefits of outsourcing, and they're outsourcing more services to more providers. And I don't mean hundreds more, but picking specific providers for specific services. But more interestingly, I think, is the stratification that's really become visible in the industry, where the largest CROs have really been integrating themselves with the largest pharma companies, pharma bio companies, in these strategic relationships that I'm sure you've all read about. But below that, there's another layer of what I'll call mid-sized CROs, and it depends on how crisply you define that, but certainly under $1 billion, but more than a couple $100 million mid-sized players. The smartest among them also seem to be structuring some partnerships with mid-sized clients. So they're kind of matching, they're not trying to fight for every project from the biggest pharma, but they're picking the right mid-sized pharmas that are the best clients, potential clients for them. Finding a way to differentiate themselves from those giant companies and delivering some different level of service. And then the same thing will happen at the next level down, and I guess small is in the eye of the beholder. I'm sure Jason doesn't consider his company small, it's more mid-sized, but wherever you cut it off, there's a small niche of CROs, not a niche, but a segment. Most of them more focused on specialty therapeutics, specialty geography, specialty services, specialty technology. They're doing the same thing that the other two groups are. Finding ways to differentiate themselves with the right kind of client. And all of you service providers in the room, including Michael and a few others like ourselves, need to focus the marketing efforts on the right kind of best prospects. Yeah, it'd be fun to go after every giant billion-dollar merger, but that's just not what we're going to do, and we're not going to capture many like that, any like that, so we don't spend any time doing it. And that I see going on more and more as CROs grow and mature, as to the companies really focusing better attention on what I'll call the right kind of client for them. Consolidation is part of what I do every day, is mostly what I do every day, and consolidation is just really, really strong. I could spend the rest of the meeting talking about trends there, but I think we'll leave that particular topic for a different question. So that's a 30,000-foot view overview, if that's okay.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, so I'd like to turn to our industry veterans, if you will. Maybe Jean Marie will start with you. I'd like to hear your thoughts on some of the mega trends shaping the market. We are all very well aware of the challenges and the dynamics of the pharma market, the pressures that are being placed on them, the patent cliff, and the expense to bring a drug to market, the time to bring a drug to market, many challenging influences going on. So I'm interested to hear, maybe start with Jean Marie, and then we'll talk to the other, get some perspectives from the other panelists on some of these trends that you see influencing in the market and how they specifically affect you and your business.
Sure, thank you, Michael. And I would certainly mirror Mike's opinion about how smaller CROs have to provide more of a niche service, because the larger CROs are partnering with the larger pharmaceutical companies. But the reality is a lot of the inventions and the know-how is now going back to where it was 30 years ago, back to the academic centers, back to small inventors. And so there's really a need, I think, to sort of reach back to the startup area, translational medicine, translational products. That's really where the opportunity is now, because there's really not those large providers to be able to help companies kind of move that through. For us, we've decided to focus more on medical device. We started out really broader, doing more pharmaceutical work. Most of that work, though, as we all see, pipelines are starting to get smaller, and there's really more of a migration towards combination products. And so medical device really is going to be a growing arena, and there's not as much expertise on a global basis for companies to be able to provide those services. We face the same trends: time, money, regulatory pressures. We're asked to do more with less. But in order to do what we need to do, we need very highly talented people. So there's a bit of an upside down, I see sort of a bit of an upside down process here, where we have very highly skilled workers, very highly compensated workers that we need to scale down to be able to provide services to smaller companies, but yet we're being asked to provide that at a lower rate and lower cost. So trying to keep that triangle equivocal of quality, time, and expertise, I think is very challenging for organizations like ours now and in the future.
Okay, thank you. Jason or Jean, you want to add your thoughts, comments?
Sure, thank you, Jason. Yeah, I definitely agree with these sentiments. And, just to add, at least like from what I observed anyway, in around 2008 timeframe, around the mortgage sort of bubble and crisis that we all sort of experienced a bit, I saw a lot of, price pressures, a lot of focus on the preclinical and the early stage side of the business. It actually almost became silly in a way, where you started seeing auctions starting to take place, and it seemed like there wasn't as much focus on the quality, and just became very price sensitive with very razor sharp margins, really. And since then I've been seeing this. First of all, a lot of consolidation within our service industry here, because largely what we do is pretty much a reflection of what's happening at large pharma. We're not necessarily driving the whole, life science industry. So now, at least I've been seeing this type of price pressures and commoditization of services, in essence, starting to go into late stage, even phase 3. So what I've been seeing personally, and the trend I sense, is just to add to the discussion here, is a lot more pressure on the mid-sized CROs. The larger ones, they have deeper pockets. They're getting into these strategic preferred provider agreements, so even if their margins are a little bit lower, at least they could really get into different services. They could take advantage of their global operational footprints. Whereas for the mid-sized players, it's definitely creating more pressure. And then for the smaller companies, such as ours, where we're staying laser focused, at least in our case in the oncology space, we've been actually enjoying the benefit of some of those consolidations and price pressures and competitions and challenges, like when a company goes through a consolidation or a merger or a takeover, they do lose some focus off their operational quality. It just sort of happens naturally. And we've definitely been getting some of that windfall. So I do see this trend continuing personally, where you're going to have the larger players getting into new, non-traditional services, growing, expanding, mid-sized CROs, which, I would sort of consider above 100 million, maybe to that billion type of range, starting to get more and more squeezed, and more specialized niche CROs coming up around the world.
So I'm curious, Jason, your thoughts, because you're more in that mid-sized arena.
Yeah, I mean, I think the change in the industry has been pretty dramatic in the last 5 years. If you were to take a look at the CRO industry, 5 years ago, there were 4 CROs that had $1 billion of revenue. You had 4 or 5 that were sitting, and at the time, I think we would call that a mid-sized CRO and maybe $250 to $1 billion. And then you had 5 or 6 that were about $100 million to $250, and then you had the fragmented piece of the market below $100 million. It's changed dramatically in 2013. There's now 7 CROs greater than $1 billion. There's 1 CRO between $250 and $1 billion, which is IMC Research. And then you've still got 5 or 6 in that $100 million to $250 million, although the names have changed. We just lost one of them with Active Solutions that was acquired by Inventive. So, I mean, I agree with all the comments. The bigger CROs are really going after those large partnerships with large pharma. And those deals, at least from what I can tell, they're volume-based, you get more revenue, the margins are a little bit lower, but in the CRO space, you get a lot of leverage on your fixed costs, so their EBITDAs are going up and their EPSs are going up. When you take a look at a company like INC, which is sitting in the middle, I kind of think they're trying to figure it out. They're not necessarily large enough to play with the billion-dollar players, and they're not really sitting in that $100 million to $250 million space where they're as flexible or really finding a niche so much. So it'll be interesting to see what they do. I completely agree with the other panelists when you're looking at CROs that are $100 million to $250 million and sub $100 million. We know this theory, we can't walk into a bid defense with a pharma company after Quintiles walks out and says, we're just as good as them because we're smaller and more flexible, right? They're going to walk in there and say, we have 29,000 people around the world, we've got scale, we've got this, we've got that. The smaller guys really need to be laser focused on what's the right size trial you're going to go after, what's the right therapeutic area you're going to go after, and really start to carve out a niche. What Jean Marie said is actually what we're doing at Theorem. We still have the traditional CRO, but we've started to really invest in the medical device arena, and we're trying to specialize in those combination trials where you've got a device that administers a drug and vice versa. And that's allowed us to carve out a niche and begin to grow and be a little bit different. At least we think we're a little bit different than the other mid-sized CROs out there. So it's interesting. There's still about 40% of the marketplace today that's fragmented. Large CROs make up about 53%, large being billion-dollar plus individuals. The 100 million to $1 billion make up about 7%. That leaves about 40% of the market fragmented out there, and it's growing at an 8 to 10% clip a year. So there's a lot of opportunity for the large guys, and a lot of opportunity for the smaller CROs to really differentiate themselves and carve out a niche for themselves.
I think it's important too to understand the other thing that's changing is we used to have larger players. You had more GSKs, you had more Merck, you had a lot of those bigger companies. And at the same time, you've got more of a proliferation of these small startup, mid-sized companies. And that's really the segment that we serve that is really growing. And I think, the challenge for us is how do we sort of mold ourselves to really fit the needs of clients like that, because it is very dynamic, it's very changing, especially with a lot of them, you have to understand their strategy. What's the strategy for them? To get their initial funding, proof of concept, maybe a first in human, and then they're looking to hopefully license to some of the larger companies or companies like Quintiles that are actually doing that development themselves. So there's a lot of things to consider. There's a lot of moving parts, I think, to that.
Yeah, and one like that, we talk about pressure, a lot of pressure on the smaller CROs because a lot of our work is transactional today. We're not signing these large deals. But just when there was a whiff of a rumor that Pfizer was going to go out there and buy AstraZeneca, look whose stock prices dropped immediately. So there's a lot of pressure once you get into that large pharma and have those big deals, because that revenue can go away, and you're stuck with hundreds of employees, maybe thousands of employees around the world that you have to repurpose. So there's a lot of pressure on both ends of the market right now.
So Jean Marie, I'd like to start with you, bounce this question off of you, to turn our attention to the future of clinical trials. So if we think about clinical trials in 5 to 10 years' time versus where we are today, what do you see as the different implications that you see for the clinical research organization?
It really is very dynamic as we continue to say. And if I look 5 and 10 years kind of down the road, I do see more and more CROs that are focusing more in a niche for different therapeutic areas. I don't foresee the larger top 2 really CROs surviving long term, because I think more of the opportunity is going to be in that 250 million and under arena, just because that's the type of client and businesses I believe will be serving, is that small market of entrepreneurs and technology really is what is where the proliferation, where the technology, where the ideas are, and the growth is. You don't really see companies building the Mercks and the SmithKlines as they used to be. They really are not built to last, but built to exit to some extent. And so I think the challenge for us is to, again, finding our niche, finding and really being the best in that area. At the same time, though, so this is sort of the challenge is what's the right size, right? Because we all need global approval, and companies want to be able to feel confident when they're hiring a company that they can control those processes in other countries. So how large do you need to be able to accommodate that? So, I think that there's a lot of things that, over time will start to play out.
Actually, on that front, Jean, I thought you had said during one of our previous discussions that ACT pretty much focuses on the U.S. market. Is that correct? And so, what's your thought relative to what Jean Marie just said? How does that impact your business? I think you guys are not only niche focused in oncology, but also in the U.S.
Correct. And yeah, I agree with these sentiments that, Jean Marie just mentioned. I would just perhaps add to that from my perspective, I feel overall the life science industry changes sort of slowly. There have been, some changes lately just because you have more regulation, you have some new expectations with, from legislatures, right, like the HIPAA Act, and the Sunshine Act, things like this. You have new technology, you have more pressures on pharma to lower the cost of their, bringing an actual molecule compound all the way through, the whole discovery process and having, a good drug available for society. So those types of pressures will continue, but I see this overall as, for us, changing slowly. I still see the U.S. market continuing to be dominant, from a position, especially with oncology around the world, although, for us, as an example, it was very important, even for phase 2 studies, to have a strong international partner that doesn't play in America, where we could just have almost like a strategic marketing type of relationship where we could, send business back and forth to each other. But I still see U.S., continuing to grow very, very nicely here. And I think now is important to stay very focused, on your overall business plan. I feel the strategy overall should be clear. And yeah, from time to time, you may need to adjust your strategy, but for the most part, I don't feel it should change, every year or 2 years. It should transcend these things, in my opinion. I think those are the things that become really successful over time. So I think for us, we'll continue to sort of, be very profitable and grow very, very nicely just because of our positioning in oncology, which I still believe is going to be the largest therapeutic area for the foreseeable future.
Of course, I disagree with that, but.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, just so the window that I look out of is when I look at healthcare here in the U.S., especially when we're talking about medical devices and our bailiwick, which is cardiovascular and diabetes space. Unfortunately, more of that technology is outside of the U.S. Unfortunately, where we are right now in the U.S., we have not done a first-in-human study in the U.S. in over 10 years. I was talking to a couple of colleagues earlier. Again, because of regulation and problems. So where are we doing first-in-human? We're doing it in Europe. We're doing it in South America. The agency has required one big company, Medtronic, to do a first-in-human here in the U.S. That's been a year. They haven't started that trial yet, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But the reality is a lot of the products that we're working on, at least from a medical device perspective, are 4 and 5 generations behind what is already approved and in practice in the rest of the world. So a lot has to do with, I think, our healthcare system, where it is right now. Regulatory barriers are challenging, and as we know, or maybe you don't know, but the FDA is setting up offices in China. The FDA is setting up offices in South America and other parts of the world. So, the U.S. is becoming very far-reaching from a regulatory perspective, and it's something that we have to take into consideration and sort of face that reality. it's a little disappointing, as an American, certainly we always expect that we should have the best and access to the best and really have the top technology, but unfortunately I don't feel that that's the reality.
Michael, I want to put a different spin on that 5 to 10 year question, and I'd be curious to hear what the other folks think of this, but how many people here have ever participated in a clinical trial? One, and this is a room of clinical trial professionals, maybe not 100%. If you go to the movies tonight, the Phillies game tonight, your church Sunday morning, or whenever you go to church and ask the same question, how many hands do you think you'll see raised? 1, 2, 3, a tiny number. And when I ask the question even more broadly, how many people in my church or the Phillies game have ever been asked to participate in a clinical trial, or have ever been told about a clinical trial by their doctor, I would bet money the number is still going to be incredibly tiny. So when you take a longer 5 to 10 years, 5 to 10 year look at the industry, I think one of the biggest changes you're going to see is the clinical research enterprise connecting more with the healthcare delivery enterprise. And you see a lot of combination companies. You see Quintiles is probably the leader in trying to connect the nature of drugs and trials with the way people use drugs and use that information to loop back into talking about the best kind of drugs to develop and the best kind of trials. And I'd be real curious as to the CRO professionals here as to how their companies kind of fit into that and whether I'm on the right track.
Well, let me just add one before you guys answer. So one additional mix to add to that is the role of social media. So as a means to connect with patients and potentially gain access and engage. So right to your point. So I'm curious if you guys are thinking about it, have it built into your strategy, what you see in the future, that role of social media.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump on that one. I think we've seen a big change. I mean, what are the two biggest reasons why clinical trials don't run on time, why they're delayed? One is getting the sites up and running, and two is finding patients. And it's getting more and more difficult to find patients as the protocols become a lot more complex. I think the role of social media has been well documented in a lot of publications over the last couple of years to try and find patients. Many times it's good news you haven't participated in a clinical trial because you're not sick, so you don't want to go participate in one. But I think clinical trials obviously have a great benefit to society, and we've got to try and find those patients to get these trials going and running. And social media is a great place. You're seeing a lot more kind of new niche businesses pop up online to try and connect patients, and it's almost like the CRO industry. There's specific disease websites to try and link patients together. So as more of those pop up and they get bigger and bigger, I think you are going to find CROs or larger site organizations get together to speed up the recruitment of patients. That's for sure.
I think in our industry, it's a bit of common sense, maybe from my perspective being a nurse, is that our industry exists because of patients and patients' needs. And unfortunately, I think patients have been lost in the mix. A lot of that here in the U.S. I think happened in the 80s with the advent of healthcare the way it was, because patients used to be directly in the middle of their care. They dealt with their doctor, they dealt with their insurance company, and at some point they were sort of removed from the equation. And so, I think it's a common sense thing to understand where the patients are. It has always been our premise to work through a lot of foundations and physician offices, because you do have to have those relationships. That's, to your point, that's where the patients are. They're at those clinical sites, and we have to provide the training and education both to the physicians, the practices, and the patients to get them engaged. Social media has certainly facilitated that. And for us, that certainly has always been part of our practice, I guess, in how we operate our business. The patient always comes first.
It's a great feature database to mine patients. I mean, the best sites today have call centers set up in their organizations. They call patients, they screen patients. You're continually doing that. It's not all connected today, right? You've got different sites all over the United States and around the world that their databases don't talk to one another because they're proprietary. They don't want to give out that information. So if you can get it online, the internet's the big equalizer. There are huge online databases that will be built for people who are looking for trials for their specific need.
My daughter works for a healthcare organization, and she was at one meeting where they first started to talk about becoming an accountable care organization to kind of blend the delivery of healthcare and the insurance. It went nowhere. It isn't going anywhere. The committee's been disbanded. So I was disappointed to hear that from her about one particular healthcare system, but that's another healthcare system connecting into the clinical research world. Sounds like a good idea to me.
And if you look at NIH in the UK, the National Health Trust there is a national database really of patients, and so it's fairly easy to recruit patients in Europe because you have this mass database. And there's obviously conversations here in the US about doing that, but then it kind of gets into your personal, how much information do you want out there? Who are you going to allow to sort of mine your data and contact you? America operates a little bit different than Europe and some other countries, but again, from a patient recruitment perspective, it's certainly easier to do outside the U.S. because you have national health programs that they basically own your private data. HIPAA doesn't really exist, so to speak, in other parts of the world. Interesting to see.
Yeah, and just to add really quick, I agree with Mike. I personally feel there's a lot more opportunity in the U.S., particularly for the sites, to connect to the people. We're seeing more of that. We've had really sort of like a dual approach where we'll maintain very good relationship and keep the sites happy, and sort of make it like a personal relationship. And at the same time, we've been striking strategic relationships with these types of networks, Mike, that you referenced. Like in New Jersey, for example, a big growing one is the HUMC with the RCCA, with Hackensack Medical, where they're literally creating these huge network of sites and maintaining these databases. So it is going to, I see that continuing to grow, and it's important to definitely be connected to that.
Okay, thanks. So I'd like to sort of turn back to a second to the question of specifically value and value creation. And I'd like to ask the panelists, in your strategic thinking, your management meetings, your team meetings, when you're thinking about your own businesses and this question of value, I'm curious, how do you think of value when you're having these discussions with your team? Do you think of it in the traditional or the accounting number sense that I described at the beginning in terms of cash flows and risks, or is it maybe with innovation or IP? Or I'm just curious what kind of conversations that you could share with us are going on in your strategic or senior leadership meetings, and how do you think about value? Maybe Jason, if you want to.
Sure. Well, we talk about value in three different ways, three buckets. The first is your traditional. We are owned by a private equity firm, so revenue, people, backlog. We have all those conversations. I think the second area is the value we're providing to the customer. If you're going to be in the CRO space, you got to provide good value to the customer, or you won't have a customer and you won't have a business at the end of the day. I think the third area that we look at is whenever an audit partners or owners decide that it's going to be time to do a transaction, how do we make firm a little bit different in the marketplace today? What's the strategic value that we're building for our business? The marketplace over the last couple of years is really dictating that, depending on who the buyer is. We've seen over the last 12 to 15 months, we've seen Apple Solutions get acquired, we've seen Novella Clinical get acquired. I don't know the exact reason why, but the word on the street is Novella got acquired by Quintiles because they have a good medical device platform, which Quintiles did not have internally. And they've got a lot of close relationships with biotechs or smaller companies that Quintiles have kind of moved away from. Apple Solutions got acquired because they had adaptive trials, and they also had a presence in Japan. So there were strategic reasons why those large companies bought the smaller CROs. Then we saw a company like Chiltern International that came out to market a couple times. This is all public record, you can Google it. And they were bigger and more profitable than both of those companies, but there was no transaction. And kind of the word on the street about that was they weren't really different. They were a little bit the same of what the larger CROs are. When you're looking at larger CROs, they win $100 million, $200 million, $300 million deals. If they're going to step down and buy a $100 million, $200 million CRO, there's got to be a compelling reason. So a strategic focus for Theorem, we talk about a great deal, and then there's all different types of buyers. It could be a big buyer, or if we're going to try and do a deal and transact with a mid-sized CRO, what do they bring into the table to really help us out there? I think just trying to gain scale today doesn't necessarily make you a more attractive or valuable CRO. If you're going to be in the global trials, having scale is definitely important, but you got to be a little bit different, because I think Gene, you mentioned earlier, we've got it's turned into a commoditized product today, or commoditized service, so bring something different to the table.
Gene or Jean Marie?
Sure, yeah, just to add, I agree with that. Look, I think from my perspective, at the end of the day, we're a professional services, industry. And we're in business, right? So we're in business to make money. And so irrespective of, what we may say sort of today, the bottom line is at least 80% of the value is really driven by your revenue, your gross margin, your EBITDA, your free cash flow, your backlog. I mean, that's it, really, in the end, right? I think Mike, you would not disagree with that. Maybe, but
Keep going.
well, let me finish up. And then, at least in my mind, the other 20%, which a lot of these things feed into the value. So, obviously, if you have the right, backlog and you have concentration and, all these other things, they're going to impact your performance over time. So I'm sort of baking that in. And these are, primarily our focus in terms of generating value. The others, I think, is really more of the intangibles where I think sometimes, especially in professional services, we lose the focus on our people and on the culture we have. And are your people, acting as ambassadors of your goodwill? Can they articulate sort of your strategy and what we do and why we do it? And that, I think, plays a huge, huge factor over the long term. So I think this is one thing that sometimes, especially with all the consolidation, especially with private equity, does get sort of lost sometimes. Is that we are professional services. We're not, for the most part, selling widgets here. And the people are a huge part of the equation. So the culture, I think, is important. And all the other things, I think, sort of course, you got your name, your goodwill associated with that. So I don't want to underestimate any of that. But I think it's important to keep the people side of the equation in mind as well.
So I see Mike kind of chomping at the bit.
No, not
I want to hear what you have to say.
I want to hear what Jean Marie has to say first about another company's view of this question.
And then I want to hear because you obviously do a lot of deals, see a lot of deals, so I'm very curious. But Jean Marie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, and certainly, we are professional services, so it's not that we have specific intellectual property, that we can add value to. Cash is always queen, obviously, and so is backlog. It's very important. But there is certainly know-how, I think, focus, the expertise probably in that area, the accessibility. I think those are all intangibles that are really very important also and should be taken into consideration as well. And I think that Josh has mentioned that, kind of what we do, everybody does, but how do we do it different? How do we do it better? Kind of what is the secret sauce maybe that makes sense? And whether it is in-house know-how, people, processes, access, I think those are all things that have to be taken into consideration. And there is some value to that also. It's a little more intangible than just numbers.
I don't have to disagree with anything that any of my fellow panelists have said. It's just the way you put it all together. As I've said in speaking in written form more than once, if you've seen one transaction, you've seen one transaction. It's a cliche to say that every individual transaction is unique, but it's the absolute truth. There are a range of different buyers. I talked about them earlier. Jason outlined a different range of potential buyers depending on the size of company. What the buyer's goal is going to influence your valuation. The market, whether you're in a hot sector or not, is going to influence your valuation. So I guess I summarize by saying it's everything. Without your numbers, Gene, buyers aren't interested, period. But with the numbers, unless there's differentiation, as Jason said, then you're not going to get the best valuation. You may not get a deal. And if you don't have the right kind of people, the leadership people, the go-to people in the industry, experts, gurus, at the very least, highly credible people, then you're not that interesting to a buyer either. So I'm not disagreeing with anything they said. I just want to kind of add a little flavor to it, and it's the market. I think Jason said that initially too. The market is going to drive the values, but there's just a whole range of factors, and I've got 18 different slides that we show prospects about value.
Could you share some of the bullets on the slide?
Well, the bullets are things we've talked about. Leadership in a category, geographic focus, therapeutic focus, management's background and intention to stay with the company and work with it. Now, Quintiles may not care about as much about that as Nordic Partners does. So again, different buyers view these drivers differently. The sector you're in clearly has something to do with it. Whether your management is staying with the company can matter a lot, even for financial buyers. Sometimes they have managers they want to put in, or sometimes they want to merge you in with another company, so they may be happy to have your management leave. But again, it's hard to say. I guess the one last thing that Mike and I were talking about earlier, all due respect to my accounting friends, Mike included, valuation isn't a number. We view it as kind of a range. And your range within the high, the low, the mid, that's what all this stuff combines to. There's a certain number that values your numbers, Gene, that we can't get you much below or much above that. But that much above or below can make a big difference, and it's numbers plus everything else.
Yeah, Mike and I were talking earlier, and he was asking me, is it a number? Do you come to a number? And I said, well, in our evaluation group, when we get engaged to do evaluation, we actually do a formal report, and we do come to a number. A lot of times, if we don't engage to do a formal evaluation, we get engaged to do like an indication evaluation. In that case, we do come to a range. But sometimes we get into supporting litigation, or obviously people dispute numbers, values, so we have to come up with a number and then be able to produce the background of how we got to that number. So, but it's a good conversation to have. I just want to be mindful of the time. There's a couple other areas I really would like to touch upon, and then have a Q&A session. And one is the concept of innovation. So we talked a little bit as a panel leading up to today's discussion about innovation and whether or not, okay, clinical research companies like accounting firms, ultimately we're all kind of in the service business. Do we really have the opportunity to innovate? So I'm curious, from the panelists, do you see, and maybe Jason, you could take a crack at leading off with this. Do you see CROs today having an opportunity to be creative, be innovative, and maybe have some examples, or is it really not a deal for CROs?
Yeah, I'm going to stay away from the scientific side of innovation, because that's definitely not anything I really know a lot about. But I think from an innovation standpoint of the industry itself, I think there's two areas. The first, an area that we invest in a great deal, is on the technology side. Our customers today, they want high quality, which is obvious, we're developing drugs for them. But they also want to have the ability to make go, no-go decisions a lot faster. So we've invested a lot of money on software and processes. Recently invested in Spotfire, a data analytic tool. We've got SaaS, more Inform, and all that. The ability to get clinical trial data faster, make sure it's relevant and clean, so our clients can make decisions earlier and save money in the long term. So from a technology standpoint, we're not developing the software, we're not being innovative with creating it, but we're trying to use that software in innovative ways to educate our customers. A second area, which I'm going to cheat here a little bit, it's not necessarily innovation we're creating new software or product, it's more like standardization for the industry. I mean, today, a lot of the waste in our industry today is we all do things differently. We probably have 500 different MSAs and contracts over the last 5 years because every company does it differently. Some companies are okay paying money up front to fund working capital, some aren't. They all have different bid grids, they have all this different ways of doing things. And if we would just do a little bit more standardization, I feel like I'm talking about the healthcare system today, but we did a lot more standardization, we would get clinical trials started a lot faster. Pharma companies would probably have less overhead in their organization structures, and so would CROs. But until we kind of get to that point where everybody tries to recreate the wheel and think they've got an edge on everybody else, there will still be waste in the system. So if we could come to some standard processes on the back office side of things, it would make things a lot easier.
Yeah, I mean, just add a little bit. I mean, I feel overall that the CRO industry is not really known for being innovative. Certainly, we can be creative with how we perform and conduct our services. When they think about our infrastructure, you're sort of talking about your people, your processes, your systems. We're not a technology organization either. That's not our focus, so we tend to, at least within our organization, ensure that our processes and systems meet the regulatory requirements, but we don't want to invest more in those areas than necessary, because ultimately we just don't feel we're going to get the right, ROI on it. We tend to make the investments in our people, and overall I feel, again, we're just more a little bit maybe creative in how we try to approach the clinical studies, but not really innovative from my perspective.
I mean, I think as a CRO, we have to be scrappy and really just to reflect, what they've already said is you have to have certain processes, but it's really about the people and how they use them. And really, it's our role to support innovation and to be able to facilitate innovation to move these products.
I really feel some compassion for my colleagues here because they, in a sense, they can't innovate too much. The customers don't want it, the FDA doesn't want it, the drug industry spends a ridiculously low amount of its resources on technology, innovation. Science is one thing, and I'm not a scientist, so I won't go there either. But there's where the innovation comes from, of discovering new molecules, new processes, new combinations of services, new ways to collect data. It's about as much as you guys can do. You're all doing it, from my perspective.
Great, thanks. So I just, again, want to watch the time if we're okay. I might go over 5 or 10 minutes. Hopefully you guys will be okay with that. But I'd like to, I still have more questions, but in the respect of time, I'd like to maybe turn it out to the audience to see if there are specific questions or do a Q&A session here for the panelists. Scott.
All right, I'm Scott Friedman, Monitor for Hire. Just to talk a little bit more about innovation, I'm kind of curious from the CRO perspective about the efforts to kind of homogenize clinical trials by Transcelerate and kind of innovate, that the sponsors are kind of driving the clinical trials process. I know we're constantly asked about the changing role of the monitor, and I'm kind of curious from the CRO perspective. You guys have a lot more moving parts than we do, so I'm kind of interested to hear, your perspective on the changes and how you're going to continue to create value when the market's kind of moving in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to tackle this one. I know that, risk-based monitoring is from Transcelerate, and they're making great inroads there. I think the concept of, how I said earlier, pharma companies want to make those go-no-go decisions a lot sooner so that they don't have to run a full phase 3 trial and whatever to spend all their money, and at the end, it failed when they could have made that decision a bit sooner. I don't think risk-based monitoring is a dramatic change operationally for the CROs. I think it's more of a change in the mindset for the FDA to accept those types of trials going forward. And, it seems like everyone's getting on board with it now. I remember being at DIA last year, and there was a lot of talk about Transcelerate. And some of the larger CROs, it was, we have to change our process and all these types of things. The industry, all industries are always going to evolve and they're always going to move on, and this will make sense to me. It doesn't necessarily save a lot of money if the data's going in the right direction, you're running a full trial, but it can create some efficiencies early on for those trials once they get up and going. So I think it's everything. It seems like everything in business today is about data. Every article I read is about data. I can pick up Sports Illustrated and I got analysts carving up the numbers in all the different directions. But if you've got data that's clean, relevant, and timely, then you can make decisions faster and you can add value to the client in that fashion. So risk-based monitoring, I think it's here to stay. I think the FDA will eventually get on board with it because they don't have to, but they kind of sort of have to. I mean, all the largest drug companies in the world are pushing for this. It will get accepted. We just need to get some of these trials through and show that it's successful, I think.
I think the challenge with it, and risk-based monitoring has a lot of different definitions still. I mean, Transcelerate is certainly trying to find what that is. And the drawback or the concern always is the verification process. How do you ensure that that's not fraud? You can mine data, you can clean data, but the actual role of a monitor is that you're physically sending someone there to actually look at a patient chart and verify the information that the physician has signed off on and that that was correctly entered into a database of some type. That's still a key role for clinical monitors. Can we change the frequency that they visit? Are there other ways that we can optimize that? Absolutely, and we should be doing that. But I would agree. I think the adoption of doing everything automatically, as you know, there are companies out there that are actually looking at combining EMR with clinical trial databases. Verification process, I think that's still the piece that has to be ironed out and that agencies have to be comfortable with. I mean, unfortunately, we're not dealing with widgets, but, these are products that end up in products for our parents and our families, medication. We're planning them, we're ingesting them. It has a little different take on it, I guess. And so you can understand a little bit of the hesitation for the agencies to just sort of, okay, the data's moving closely, it's all good, and just accept it as it is. And I think that's what's going to take a little bit of time, is that verification process. But monitoring is very expensive. I mean, that's a key place for us, too. And if you want to cut, sometimes, 40 to a little bit more, 40% of the budget might be just to monitoring. Travel and site visits are very costly.
Other questions? Ed?
Ed Henkler, change tends to be cyclic, and a lot of outsourcing has been going on for a while now, and yet now other industries, you see GE insourcing, and then they're finding all sorts of creativity and innovation from that. I'd say CROs are still, if the trend is heading out, where do you see that cycle ending? How do you remain relevant when it ends?
So, I'll jump on this. I mean, the data that's been put out there, what's estimated, is that the industry is going to grow. Not R&D investment's not going to grow 8% to 10% from now to 2020. That's going to be pretty much flat. It's going to be 1 to 3%, pretty much in line with inflation. But the amount that the pharma companies are going to outsource is going to go from about 25 to 30% of all clinical work is outsourced today. By 2020, that's expected to be in the 45 to 50% range. So we're still in the middle innings of this curve of the outsourcing, really about the CROs. And it wouldn't shock me if that continued on, because if it's going to get up to 45 to 50%, that means there's a lot of pharma companies that are going to be moving a lot of their employees over to the CROs, either through rebadging or through layoffs, and they can just get rehired. So I don't think we've hit to that end. Now, the CROs that are the winners out of all of this are going to be the ones that do everything we really talked about today. Are they adding value? Are they providing good quality? Is it a good service? There's going to be all sorts of clinical trials, and I actually think there's room for all different size CROs. Just 3, 4, 5 years ago, when we were selling Theorem, when it was Omnicare, we sat in with a private equity firm, and they said, I'm not so sure there's even a need for another $90 million CRO and a $100 million CRO at the time. So they kind of dismissed us. Well, we've grown double digits over the last 3 years. The industry's been growing, and I think the actual change in the market dynamics from large and small has benefited, and I'll call us a mid-sized CRO, because if you had a pharma company or a biotech company and you had a $5 million trial that you had to run, would you immediately give it to Quintiles, whose main customers are Pfizer or other large CROs, and you know where their main focus is going to be? That is not a knock on Quintiles whatsoever, or any of the large CROs. They're all great CROs. They got to their size because they're great CROs. But if I had my one trial that I had to run, I might want to give it to a smaller CRO because I know it's a big part of their business, and I know it'll get the right care and feeding that it needs. So we're in the early stages of this, of the outsourcing. I think it's going to mature over the next 8 to 10 years. And at that point in time, we'll see. We'll figure it out. If it's going to go from 50 to 75%, then we'll still be riding that wave.
I don't really worry about that insourcing coming back with more and more small companies, and even mid-sized pharma companies, as they buy small companies and get to be mid-sized. They're not creating the infrastructure to do clinical research, and more, they're not creating it to do preclinical research either. So I see all those same estimates, and if anything, I think they may prove to be low when we all gather together in another 10 years. That outsourcing penetration across a variety of functions and a variety of different kinds of companies I don't see a ceiling on it. Right?
Infrastructure for biotech can be looked at as a weakness down the line. I don't think their investors want to have an infrastructure. They want a virtual company, all the values in the common.
Yeah, I agree, and just to add a little bit, I completely agree with these comments, it's just, it's interesting because, right, the large pharmaceuticals are really doing all of this outsourcing in order to minimize their costs, right? They leverage certain risks. I mean, you know, one of their largest costs is maintaining the cost of people. So ultimately, as they do this outsourcing, they're looking to maximize their profitability. So what's happening, I think, in our industry as part of this is giving more birth and rise in pressure to FSP, functional service provider type of models, which then they're expecting the CROs to then, you know, basically take these people, as you said, back on their payroll and all of the, you know, related payroll costs that come with that, and then provide these services back to the pharmaceutical companies at a very low margin. So we're actually, from our company, we're not chasing this type of a business model on our end, but we're more sort of taking advantage of some of the consulting opportunities that this is giving rise to.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Frank?
Yes, question is a global competition. Right now, the big pharmaceutical companies outsourcing department use global CRO to leverage US CRO. They use like an Indian or China CRO's price and then talk about the to US CRO and then use the same price and won't get the job done. How you see the trend? When this trend will be stabilized?
Gene?
Sure, I could take that, or unless you want to go first. I think that's a great question, you know, and I see this trend continuing. From at least what I've observed is the larger companies are insisting, especially their outsourcing departments are gaining in visibility and power, influence. You know, they do tend to want more preferred provider type of relationships. So unless you're a global company with a full suite of comprehensive services, I see it becoming harder and harder to penetrate some of these types of accounts. So really our focus has been to maintain a very high satisfaction rate with our current clients. Actually, we have like a 95% repeat business rate because for us it's much cheaper to keep a customer happy and get repeat business, even if that means we sacrifice certain change orders or what have you, rather than trying to get a new account. On top of that, the trends I've been seeing is it tends now longer. The whole RFP process has gotten longer. So in the past, you might have been approached by a client, you might have had a win within 3-4 months. Now we're seeing that 6 to 9 months for whatever. I'm sure there's a number of reasons for that. So I see that trend continuing for some time.
I think that's a great question. I mean, it's a really great question. The perception in the marketplace today is you have to be global, big and global, have your own infrastructure to service global trials. You know, infrastructure, being in 27 countries as we are, today it's an asset for us. 4 years ago, when the company wasn't doing so hot at Omnicare, it was a burden because you've got to feed those different geographies. I think it really determines on who the customer is. I wouldn't turn around and say to Jean Marie that she couldn't run a global clinical trial. I think she's got a specific area that they're really good at. She can partner up with somebody to maybe fill in the gaps if need be. You know, we're large. I mean, we are in the areas you mentioned. We've got almost 400 people in Bangalore, India, doing data management biostats. So we've got a pretty large functional service piece of our business. We've got 80 to 90 people in China, and we've got another 25 to 35 in Asia over there, so we can run those trials. But it depends on the customer. I mean, we don't walk into clients and say, "Hey, great, you're global. We're just going to give you the work." You still have to have the therapeutic expertise. You still got to be able to deliver high quality. You still got to have the relationship. This is a big-time relationship business. A lot of times you wouldn't work because you've got a very strong relationship with the person on the other side, or they like the project manager. Having the scale is an asset depending on the size trial you're going after, depending on the customer, and depending on the type of trial and therapeutic area you're going after. You You just have to use that asset in the right way in order to win the work.
Maybe last question?
Margie Ross here. I have a consulting company on good manufacturing practice, QA, for clinical product. I was QA lead at Medirex. BMS bought Medirex, your boy oncology product got approved only months later. I happen to know some of that was because of the good QA practices and the manufacturer. But to the point about monitoring and quality of the product, what fear level do you have coming in? The product, you have to sort of accept it as a given. To what degree do you have suspicions or any practices that go back and take even a distant look at the manufacturing, which might turn out to be a problem, later on, given the freedom that there is and maybe, reliance on CMOs, possibly justified, possibly not?
From a CRO perspective, again, it depends on the clients that we're working with. Since we work with a lot of small startup companies, certainly contract manufacturing is something that does come up. And for us, we have a QA team that's responsible for going out and really qualifying those vendors so that we have good documentation of the process and the quality checks, and to be sure that the quality files are appropriate and done. And that's usually done on behalf of our clients. Our clients engage us to do that. So at least for us specifically, contract manufacturing is a vendor for us, not an in-house capability.
But it's something that you do take the time to go out and take a look at to make sure that what you're getting is going to hold water.
As a CRO, it is our responsibility, because if we are using vendors, whether it's an EDC vendor or safety or depending on what it is that the client needs, it's absolutely our responsibility to perform due diligence on them and have an audit report to mitigate risk.
And what's your percentage, generally speaking, coming from CMOs, coming from the company itself, the source company? 100%? Percentage of your QA group finds that what you've seen is acceptable, your due diligence indicates that, no major problems.
Specifically, I can't think of any major findings. Certainly there's always some quality improvements, always a better mousetrap to some extent, but nothing that made us say, absolutely cannot use this vendor.
So no fatal errors generally.
That may be different for my colleagues here.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing the same thing. So if you go to the FIRM website, you'll see some of the partners that we're working with. We audit all of them, make sure that they've got the same quality standards we do. It's not just a rubber stamp. We walk in and say, hey, you're doing good. We just walked away from a potential sizable acquisition that we were going to do. And one of the pieces that was the tipping point is we didn't think their quality organization was at the same standards that we want. So it's, again, I mean, you can lose your business if you don't have high quality standards. So it's important for us.
Okay, thanks. I would like to run a little bit late, maybe take, each panelist maybe take a minute or two, and a key thought or takeaway you'd like to leave the room with. Any one bullet point? Mike?
I find it hard to summarize. It's just a growing industry with a lot of good, solid professionals in it, and I continue to wish everybody well.
No, I would just mirror that. I think it is a great opportunity for us. It's a growing industry. It's still a little bit of the Wild West, but I think it's very interesting. And where else can you do good and make money at the same time? So I think it's a very good.
I strongly agree. And I would just add, I think, from my perspective, having a clear and defined strategy is very important. From my perspective, the strategy should be hopefully long-term in nature and shouldn't fluctuate. I've seen a lot of companies, not just in life sciences in general, where the weather changes and their overall arching strategies change, and this creates a lot of inefficiency. Maybe some of you have seen that too, based on your reactions. So I think the strategy is important. I think to stay committed to that strategy is very important. I think in our society too, sometimes we tend to not always give things 100%. Sometimes there is a need to change it, but those are extremes in my experience. And we should not forget our people. people make a huge difference. We're a service industry. I think it's important and strategic when you have a very high employee satisfaction score, when your employees can articulate and know your business and they're happy and they're going out and taking good care of your clients and almost acting as ambassadors of your goodwill. It's expensive to replace good employees. It's expensive to repeat, and replace good customers that could be lost sometimes because you don't have the right employee.
Yeah, it's an interesting space. I always say one day I'm going to write a book. I've only been in it for about 6 years. I've been through 3 transactions. It is, in my career, it's the most competitive industry I've been in. The sheer fact that, we go after trials that can range from $500,000 up to far, as high as $30 million. We compete with Quintiles, PPD, all the big guys. We compete with all the mid-sized guys, and we're probably even competing with UT Radio on some of those opportunities. And what other industry do you really have that? And oh, by the way, you're in 27 countries around the world, 1,300 employees, all the different cultures. Infrastructure, I think, goes along with it. It's a fast-paced, growing, very interesting industry that, the plus side is it really does provide a lot of good things for the society as well as. We know only a few drugs really get through the process to be approved, but they get approved and they help a lot of people around the world. So it's a great place to be.
Well, thank you all. And for me, I'd just like to draw us back to my definition of value. So companies, businesses realize more value when they're going through a strategic or a financial acquisition when companies pay for cash flow. So the things that you can do to focus on to improve the cash flow of the business obviously will enhance or increase your value. And they also pay more when there's reduced risk. So things that you can do to reduce the risk of the business. It's that equation of cash flow divided by the interest rate, which is a reflection of the risk associated with the business, is going to drive up the value. So hopefully you were able to realize some tidbits, some insights from today's discussion on things that are influencing those aspects of creating and driving value for the clinical research organization and the industry that we serve. So appreciate everyone's attendance and participation, and there's a networking following here now. Go grab more coffee or tea or some Danish or some of the breakfast out there, and thank you and all have a great